I just had a really interesting conversation with a guy named Keith Mueller out of Boulder, Colorado. He's a practitioner that works with endurance athletes like runners and cyclists and trail runners, ultra marathoners, that sort of thing. Helps them get stronger in the gym so they can be more resilient out on the trail and the field of play. And he gave me his top tips when he's teaching respiratory training to his athletes. Check this out.
So ultimately, my point is I think the chest breathing versus belly breathing is kind of like a false dichotomy that people get caught into.
Right.
Both are equally dysfunctional in different ways. And I thought, sure. So this is what I think is like the bedrock, like the point. So
Yeah.
inhalation and exhalation are driven by a pressure differential between the inside of the lungs, the outside of the lungs in the thoracic cavity that they inhabit, and the external environment. That pressure differential arises from a volume change in the thoracic cavity and the clear relationship between volume and pressure,
Hmm.
right? The way, like the lungs are not muscles. We know that they're
Nope.
these passive balloons of air, and something has to be driving that
Yep.
change. So number two, the main driver of this volume change is the excursion of the respiratory diaphragm. It's the king breathing muscle. All breathing is reflexively diaphragmatic in healthy individuals. That's like one of my big things is like I try to tell people, hey, we don't need to worry about the diaphragm too much. If we're getting the rib cage to do the right thing, it's going to be happening really well on its own. The only situation in which we would say maybe we're not getting what we want out of the diaphragm is if we have like that apical breathing, that really shrug, scalene
Hmm.
driven breathing. It's
Yep.
like instead of getting that flattening and descending, I think of it as like when you take a cup and put it upside down in a bucket of water and you pull on the cup and there's that suction. It's
Yep.
like a completely different mechanism for creating that volume change. That
Yeah.
starts to be like, okay, we're in new territory.
Yeah.
So anyway, all breathing is reflexively diaphragmatic in healthy individuals. So number three, for me, the diaphragm is among the most slow twitch and fatigue resistant skeletal muscles in the body. Describing breathing volume and sequence as dysfunctional versus optimal is mostly a function of the expansion and compression of the thoracic cavity via motion of the ribs, sternum, and thoracic vertebrae. So it's like all the accessory joints and muscles that I think are like the real genius of what a device like the isocapnic does is being able to work on that stuff to help
Hmm.
offload the diaphragm, which is something that I mentioned later. And again, this
Yeah.
is just the way I think about it.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
number four, full excursion of the diaphragm requires simultaneous 360-degree expansion and compression of the lower ribs, which is like a bucket handle motion, is how I've been taught about it,
Yep.
internal and external rotation of the ribs. And this, I've heard it called like a zone of apposition, allows for full lengthening of the diaphragm on inhales and full shortening on exhales. Like we'll never get full, uh, that full length change of the diaphragm muscle if the lower ribs aren't kind of changing along with it,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. I like that.
Like
Yeah.
those lower ribs pulling apart helps the diaphragm to flatten out and descend, and the
Yeah.
lower ribs coming together and closing helps it dome up even more. So
Yeah.
ultimately, this zone of apposition allows for that full lengthening, full shortening, and optimal mechanical leverage for the diaphragm throughout its excursion. So number six, simultaneous expansion of the posterior mediastinum, apical expansion in the chest, and the lateral rib cage, which we can think of as like pump handle motion, the sternum and the spine getting further apart from each other front to back.
Yep. Yep.
That drives further volume change. So we had like the low down diaphragmatic stuff, but then the up top stuff.
Yep.
Um, Ultimately, quote unquote, global volume change occurs simultaneously at all tidal volumes, depending on positional constraints. And this works to offload the diaphragm at high rates of ventilation, distributes the work of breathing and posture across as many joints and tissues as possible, and increases the ability to keep volume and rate coupled together. So
Hmm.
ultimately, my point is I think the chest breathing versus belly breathing is kind of like a false dichotomy that people get caught into.
Right.
Both are equally dysfunctional in different ways. And I think the point is like, especially when we take into consideration like positional constraints that wouldn't allow your belly to expand, like maybe
Hmm.
you're running and you need that deep core that
Or
would be
you're in,
driving
or
that.
yeah, or in an arrow position or something.
Exactly, totally.
Yeah.
Yeah. So if there's something where position or muscle tension is stopping that belly from really going, it's really
Yeah.
rib cage, rib cage, rib cage. Right.
Yep.
So I'm cueing people about that versus the belly. And it's like, it's kind of the same thing. All roads lead to Rome if you get somebody taking these big,
Yeah.
expansive breaths. But
Well,
like
yeah, and
for
I think
me,
like yeah, like the way I'm sort of digesting what it is that you're saying is that like your sort of top priority, movement focus is really like that bucket handle edge of the rib cage, the bottom
Getting
phalanges as they move out.
Yeah, my big cue for people is expanding into every little bit of the bra strap or where a heart rate chest strap would be, right?
Right.
You want to
Okay.
put like a belt or a band around the rib cage and feel yourself going out in all
Yeah.
directions simultaneously. It's
Yeah.
so easy for people to just blow open the front, whether
Yep.
it's
Yep.
that like chest apical breath or like just the front ribs blowing open. You'll see people with rib flare. Like my
Hmm.
understanding is rib flare in the front is like never really driving that full exhale where you think of the ribs as fingertips that are like pulling together.
Right.